Russell, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on.
That's okay. I really appreciate you joining us. So, what we're going to do is jump straight in to our first question, which is kind of our signature question, which we ask everyone. What is your definition of a leader, given your experience?
I think, yeah, my experience, crikey. I've definitely had some experience of leadership being tested, that's for sure. I think the military analogy always kind of springs to mind with me when it comes to leadership. And I know it can seem a bit dramatic to say, well, you should be first out the trenches and, running along with your bayonet fixed and so on. But I do think that is the epitome of leadership. That is, people want to follow you because they respect you and, I don't know, in some small way admire you, I suppose. I think you've got to be seen to be brave, bold, interesting, charismatic. Not scared of making decisions, and certainly not scared of making the wrong decision, which of course we all do, but we seem to have this stigma, don't we, in
Mm,
Britain, and certainly in business in Britain, where in corporate world particularly, failure and mistakes are frowned upon. I actually think, as you might want to expand on, the opposite should be encouraged. So I think having that kind of that charisma and that boldness and bravery where you will do anything, and potentially if you've come from the bottom, I suppose, certainly as I have in the property industry. At 16 years old, I was making the tea and licking envelopes and so on, and some would say I should have stayed there, and I haven't perhaps progressed much since. No, but that kind of DNA, that journey, I think
mm.
perhaps does resonate with people that decide to follow. Can I give you an example?
Yeah, please do.
So at the end of the Emoov journey, and some may not know that Emoov. Saved by the bell nearly. So the Emoov journey in brief started in 2010. Little online agent before there were really any online agents, maybe one or two. And I grew the business over a period of time with a lot of venture capital funding, lots of people kind of not throwing money at us, but encouraging us to use
Mm,
money to grow. That money ran out. We couldn't raise any more money towards the end of 2018. But here's the kind of anecdote. I'd kind of spent 9 years leading from the front. And at first it was me, and then it was a lady by the name of Lauren Rutherford, who was my first employee. Then we got to 6, then 9, and then somehow 140 employees
mm.
over that period of time. So when the business failed, we were at 140 employees. I'd kind of led that business very visually and from the perspective of encouraging a kind of family type culture. And I don't mean being soft and fluffy, but I just
Mm.
mean having a kind of an inclusive, respectful type of approach, to the point then when I stood up in November 2018 and I chose to stand in front of all of my staff every Friday in the dying weeks of that business
Yeah.
to tell them what was happening. At the end of pretty much my last kind of soapbox stand in that
Mm.
respect, I kind of looked across the room and kind of finished my update in terms of what I thought was going to happen to the business, hoping to save it. I've got people interested in buying it, fingers crossed, fingers crossed.
Mm.
And then I did a Q&A, and I thought, it's only right that the staff should be able to ask questions to get honest answers. So, of course, the first question that was thrown at me was, are we going to get paid this month?
Yeah.
And it was a horrible question, but a fair one.
Yeah.
And one that I answered like this. I said, genuinely, I don't know. But I'll tell you one thing. I said, if you don't get paid, nor will I. And
Mm.
actually, that remained true. I didn't take a salary after anybody else took a salary. So I was kind of in the trenches, so to speak. Anyway, there were a whole bunch of questions thereafter around the kind of the potential longevity of the business. Would we survive? Wouldn't we survive? And I was very honest and very clear. And I said, look, we might not. Obviously, I'm hanging on here, trying to do everything I can to save this business, but I can't guarantee it. And someone then said to me, well, look, should we turn up on Monday? And my response was, look, I hope you will, but I can't guarantee that if you do, having paid to get here, that you'll be paid at the end of November.
Mm.
Would you believe that when I turned up on Monday morning at 8:45, whatever it was, everybody turned up?
Yeah.
Everybody turned up.
Says something about the culture that you obviously created within
Yeah,
the organisation.
and it kind of almost brings tears to my eyes now, to be honest. That I thought, my God, those people were so into the business and were so, I don't know, respectful, or so kind of into the culture of the
Yeah.
business that I'd created, that even though they thought they might not might not get paid, they still turned up and were still willing to put a few days' work in, just in case it did come good. And I think, look, I'm not saying that I'm the greatest leader since, I don't know, whoever, Genghis Khan, who some might compare me to him. But he was a great leader, apparently.
Yeah,
but I'm not saying I am. I'm not saying I am. But I'm just saying that, look, having respect for your staff and being honest with them and, just kind of bringing them with you, it results in that kind of loyalty.
How do you say leadership change from an organisation that's, 1 to 10 staff, 50 plus, 100 plus? Where's the tipping point, and how does that change for you as a leader? How do you need to try and manage that situation?
Yeah, I read somewhere that they reckon that you can't deal with more than 140 people at a time in one kind of cohort. That over and above that, it starts to get very fractious and kind of disorganized. I actually think that when startups get kind of too big, when they raise too much money, when businesses become corporates, where, let's say, they cease to be entrepreneurial because they don't need to be entrepreneurial because they've kind of braved all the obstacles and have now kind of got a sufficient traction, then they change. And I'll use, if I may, this might be somewhat controversial, but I've written about them a lot recently in my column in Property Industry Eye. You look at Purple Bricks. When Purple Bricks was founded by the Bruce brothers in 2014, it was very scrappy, very entrepreneurial. It was all about the Bruces. They led from the front, and they didn't do everything right, and perhaps they sailed a bit close to the wind in some respects. They won't mind me saying that. But that business now, kind of 2 years on from Michael and Kenny leaving, is a corporate business that has lost its way. It's got no soul. It's got no culture. They've just let a whole load of people down, actually, in terms of the 600 LPEs that they forced to become employed. Rather than self-employed. Terrible lack of communication, apparently. So I'm told by many of those LPEs. So that transition happened about 2 years ago. And it's difficult to know whether it happened because Michael and Kenny left. So to your question, is it a case of it happened because the personalities at the top changed, or whether it just became a big lumbering corporate entity because of the volume of transactions it was doing, the revenue that it was generating, the money it had kind of that it had accrued? I do think, though, there are two types of CEO. There's the scrappy entrepreneurial CEO that has ideas, grows businesses, and gets to a point where then I think they should hand over to the second type, which is the corporate hand on the tiller. Let's just keep it all running like this. Yeah. The problem in business, and there's a certain business that springs to mind that I can't mention, unfortunately, but absolutely springs to mind, where those things are ran the wrong way. So, we've all seen stories of businesses like Uber, for instance, and there's loads of PropTech businesses like Goodlord, for instance, that have lost their entrepreneurial CEO in favour of a corporate guy. But at the right time. But there are other businesses that have currently got a corporate CEO in place who is running it like a corporate, but it needs to be a scrappy entrepreneurial business. So it's messed up. They are too early for their business. So look, it's fascinating, and there's all sorts of books have been written about this stuff. One is Rocket Fuel, which recognises, for instance, the difference between a CEO and a COO, and that when you actually understand that you're a CEO and not a COO, or a COO and not a CEO, when there's two of you that recognise your roles and you come together, that is a spark. That's Rocket Fuel. But it's very rare because most people in senior positions, particularly founders and CEOs, don't want to acknowledge that actually maybe I'm not a CEO. Maybe I should just be the CTO and bring a CEO into the business. Maybe I'm a COO and I should bring the CEO into the business. Most CEOs want to stay CEOs because of the title, and they I think need to question that egotistical logic.
A great example of that is Ben Francis at Gymshark. He I wouldn't say demoted himself, but he was a CEO. He recognised, so he had that self-awareness to change his position, go into different departments within the brand, and now he's going to be the CEO again because he feels the company for the time's right. So that's great.
And another great example is Google. Sergey and Brin haven't been CEO for ages. then you've got businesses like WeWork. I'm just reading. It's behind me, I think. There it
Yeah.
is.
So Adam,
The cult of We, Adam Newman. He
Yeah.
should have stood down as CEO a long, long time ago, because he was, well, let's just say he was the scrappy entrepreneurial visionary. Some would say fantasist, but he should not have been running that business when it was allegedly worth $47 billion, which of course it was never worth. But you take my point.
Absolutely. What do you think's, given your past experiences within the public sector as well? It was interesting to, when I was researching you, that you worked for, was it the Brentwood Council? So you've worked for a number of positions in the public sector. How do you see leadership differently within public sector to private sector?
Oh my!
Is there a way?
Chalk and cheese. Chalk and cheese.
I thought
so
it might be.
I was elected as a councillor in 2006. I stood down in 2015. I chaired planning committees, asset committees, environment committees, all sorts of stuff. I was schooled by Brandon Lewis, who was the leader of the council. He's now a cabinet minister, so he's cabinet minister for Northern Ireland as we speak. And our MP was Eric Pickles, who was also sometime later chairman of the Conservative Party. So they were kind of my mentors in politics. Actually, what I found, and so I'm hesitating, because in public sector world, there are two leaders effectively. You've got the elected leaders, i.e. Prime Minister, leader of a council, ministers, cabinet ministers, and so on. And then you've got the civil servants, like the permanent secretaries and in councils, the chief executives and so on. They do different jobs. So members, elected people, should be all about the kind of the schmoozing, the PR, and above all, the policy and the strategy. The civil servants are about the execution. They're about doing what the members have decreed should be done. But of course, anyone that's watched Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister will know actually that most civil servants have their own agenda and they want their own thing done in their own way, and they don't want pesky members, pesky elected politicians to get in the way. My experience of public versus private was very interesting. I would literally, my office, the Emoov, was 200 yards away from the council offices. So some days I would walk, probably run most of the time, from my office for Emoov in my private sector kind of environment. I'd run up to the town hall and go into meetings there literally 5 minutes later, and would find that the pace was incredibly different. The lack of accountability in terms of people wanting to take responsibility for anything in the public sector was acute, and that there was lots and lots of procrastination, literally, if the phone's ringing and I'm only halfway through an article and it's a minute to 5, indeed a minute to 4:30 on a Friday still at Brentwood, appallingly, they would literally get up and leave. There was
why
no
do you
buy-in.
think that?
There was no buy-in.
Yeah. Do you think that's what it is? They don't believe, they didn't buy into the vision of what they were a part of, or do you think it's just a huge cultural issue within local authorities that?
Yeah, it's kind of all of the above, I suppose. But particularly in the private sector, you've got something to gain. So hopefully, the harder and the smarter I work, the better the holiday I can have, the better school my kids can go to. In the public sector, what you soon realise, and this is the problem with socialism, actually, if we want to get political for a second. If you're all going to earn the same, no matter what you do, well, then guess what? You find the least line of resistance, which is sitting there doing very little if you can get away with it. And actually, whether I think, and I'm sure many would disagree with this, but the public sector, whether it's train, TfL operators, where when you walk through the gates at Liverpool Street or King's Cross, and there seems to be 19 TfL individuals standing there talking about what was on the telly last night, and not actually doing any work. And you think, why does it even need 19 of you? Surely you could do this with 2 of you. So they find the least line of resistance. They work as slowly as they possibly can, up to the point that they can get away with it. So it's doing as little as possible and still getting paid. And then, of course, the unions kick in. So you've got me on a political rant now. The unions kick in and say, well, actually, why shouldn't we work 3 days a week? And why can't we have a 20% pay increase? And, I know little Johnny smacked his boss in the face and you fired him, but you shouldn't have done, because he was just having a bad day. That's an appalling state of affairs that we've kind of found ourselves in, where the public sector, I think, the individuals are just trying to find the laziest way to exist possible while still maintaining their jobs. And that's the difference between public and private sector. In the private sector, you work, you earn. The better you do, the better you do. In the public sector, you might as well get away with whatever you can.
Yeah, no, thank
Controversial.
very much.
Controversial.
Well, it's kind of
But
the truth.
I'm not saying it from the point of view of reading a book. I saw it for 8
Yeah,
years.
and you had an incredible contrast as well, walking from one to the other.
I would literally, in Emoov, there'd be an issue, we'd have a quick meeting, we'd talk about it, we'd find a solution, and then we'd meet 2 or 3 days later to see if that solution had worked. That would take 3 months at Bruntwood Council. Literally, what took me 3 days in the private sector would take me 3 months in the public sector, no kidding.
What do you think is the biggest issue at the moment in terms of property? So, I mean, is it the amount of housing that's being built? Is it social issue? What do you think the biggest problem the government have got on their hands right now related to property, and what could they do to potentially solve that problem?
Definitely a lack of supply. So the government's own target is to build 300,000 new homes a year, including the element of housing stock that comes as a consequence of permitted development, which is the stuff that you don't actually need planning permission for, and is often converted offices to residential, for instance. So the UK's supply actually hovers, latterly around 220, 240,000 units a year. So we're desperately short still, and we have been since the days of Macmillan back in the 1950s. So there's definitely an issue in terms of supply. The government doesn't understand property. And look, I might get a bit more controversial here, I'm afraid, but not only do they generally have idiots running departments responsible for property. So Robert Jenrick, the Minister of Housing, Communities and Local Government, seems to spend more time dining with people like Richard Desmond and doing deals around the dinner table than he does actually making sure that the UK is executing on building the right amount of properties. The politicians' kind of approach seems to be very self-serving. So if you're a Minister for Housing, or the Minister for Housing, Community and Local Government, which is basically his boss at cabinet level, one has to ask why the Housing Minister doesn't sit in cabinet, by the way, when it's such an important thing, but he doesn't. The MHCLG Cabinet Minister, Robert Jenrick, does, but the Minister for Housing, of which we've had 10 in the last 10 years, does not sit at cabinet. They seem to be fixated on headlines. And when you're a politician that wants to keep your job in the ministry or in cabinet, it is very, very tempting, and indeed wants to keep their job as an MP. It's very tempting to use the wheels of government and the funding that government has to issue all sorts of press releases about what we're going to do, and we're going to solve this, and we're going to stick. There's one this week, £8 billion going into social housing. Well, that's been heralded as a new announcement, but that's old money. That was announced in the budget, and it was announced partly last year. That's not new money at all. It's a con. And the question for government has to be, does funding create all solutions? Well, money's very important when it comes to building houses,
but if it's used correctly.
Well, exactly. And so strategy and policy and execution, and taking £8 billion and giving it to a load of useless housing associations that seem to be more intent on making profit than they do houses now, giving it to a load of developers that are definitely only interested in the business of profit, and that's why the likes of Persimmon and Bovis and others make £1 billion a year. Good luck to them, but don't make them responsible for social housing. They don't care about social housing. They care about building housing to keep their shareholders happy. Who are they going to be beholden to? Social conscience or shareholders? I'll tell you, it's the latter. It's absolutely the latter. So government don't know what they're doing when it comes to housing. They have a revolving door of housing ministers, which means everybody kind of avoids responsibility, really. And because they can avoid responsibility, they can issue a press release today saying, oh, I've found another £3 billion. I'm going to spend it all on, I don't know, homes for unmarried parents in Toxteth or whatever it might be. And of course, if that doesn't actually happen, probably everyone's forgotten 12 months later. What happened to garden towns and garden villages? Do you remember them 10 years ago?
Yeah.
I remember being on the BBC talking about those. It was tens of billions of pounds of government funding to create garden towns and garden villages across the UK. Guess how many have been produced in 10 years? None.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it?
None.
The amount of
but we keep electing we keep electing these governments. We're the idiots because we keep electing these idiots to do the opposite to what they told us they were going to do. So we have ourselves to blame.
We have to take responsibility and accountability. I agree with you there. Do you think, given the housing market and how it's propelled, shall we say, over the last 12 months, 18 months in terms of prices just going absolutely crazy. Do you think we're in line for a correction anytime soon?
I think we're in line for a reduction in the rate of growth, yes. I don't think that just because it's very easy to say, well, house prices are 11% higher this year than the same time last year, which is what the Nationwide said this week is the case. But that doesn't mean that 11% growth means a decline in property values a year later. It's not a seesaw.
Yeah.
But I think what we will see is a decline in the rate of growth. So I would expect to see house prices. In fact, I've just done a thing for Reuters on this, that next year, 2022, we'll probably see house prices higher by 4 or 5%. Why don't I think that it will carry on as it has? Well, because we don't have the stamp duty holiday as the artificial fuel.
Yeah.
But the reason it won't crash is because of what we just talked about in terms of the supply-demand imbalance, and particularly 2 or 3 other things. So first of all, the ridiculously low cost of borrowing. So you can go and get a mortgage now at whatever 1.5% fixed for 3 years with a 10% deposit. I mean, that's just nuts. I still remember the days of 10% mortgages. So the cheaper that mortgages get in interest rate terms, the cheaper the repayments, the more you can afford to borrow, and therefore the more that demand pushes up house prices. The other issue, of course, is wage growth. Who would have thought that 18 months into this kind of pandemic, we're now seeing a massive labour shortage in the UK and wage growth sitting at 8% per annum? I mean, it should be about 2%. But of course, lorry drivers working for IKEA and John Lewis apparently now paid more than lawyers. Blah, blah, blah. It's a wonder we've got anyone unemployed at all. God knows why we've got 1 million people unemployed. But anyway, so whilst we've got almost full employment, cheap money, and people earning more than they ever have in terms of growth, that will keep demand for housing going, and therefore we won't see a correction in terms of house prices dropping.
Do you believe in property cycles, Russell?
Yeah, all markets are cyclical.
Yeah.
I don't believe that there's a pattern. No, there's no pattern. These idiots at Savills, Knight Frank, Bank of England, even the Chancellor of the Exchequer, let's cast our minds back to 2015-16 before the Brexit vote. All of these so-called experts were saying that if we voted Brexit, house prices would drop. In fact, George Osborne was the Chancellor at the time. He specifically said, this is exactly what he said, house prices will drop by 18% if we vote for Brexit. It was an absolute crock of
shit.
You know what?
It's fine.
Yes. Can I say shit?
Oh, yeah, you can say it, it's no problem.
An absolute crock of shit that he, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man with, his hands on our purse strings, should never said. The Bank of England said similar. Then, of course, when we headed towards no-deal Brexit, Mark Carney, the then Bank of England governor, and all sorts of other so-called experts said the same. Capital economics, I think HSBC, all these other idiots said the same thing because it just fitted a narrative. It seemed right. And, of course, then we had the same with the pandemic. I famously said in March 2020, as the pandemic was biting, and even when the property market got locked down for 3 months, I said house prices will not drop. And I bet a lot of people, 200, 300, 400 quid a time, I said in 12 months' time, house prices will not be lower. I had a queue of people taking my money. And by the way, if any of you are watching, only 2 people have paid. And not to me, because the chosen charity for this, by the way, was Great Ormond Street. Paul Champlain, I think 2 others have paid up, but everybody else now, fun enough, they've all gone very, very quiet. So no, I believe that markets go like that, but you can't put an algorithm on them and say, in June 2024, this is what will happen to house prices. Because who could have predicted the pandemic? And secondly, who would have predicted a pandemic pushing house prices up by 11%?
Not one person, I can tell
Apart
you
from
that
me.
right now. Apart from you, Russell, sorry.
Sorry, sounds very big-headed and glib, but I said the house prices won't drop, and they've done the opposite of dropping.
For a lot of our listeners are property professionals, property entrepreneurs. What do you, and especially some people looking to start a career in property as well, if you were starting a career in property now, what area would you go into?
Oh, what a question. And should it be said that I haven't had any advance notice to these questions? No, not that I've asked for them, I never would. But so the 2 areas I would go into are prop tech of sorts, but not prop tech for prop tech's sake. There are too many prop tech solutions that are not solutions at all. They're solutions trying to find a problem. So finding something that does something like Fixflow, which is now obviously sold, good lord to an extent. There's a whole bunch of prop tech solutions that actually work.
Yeah.
So trying to actually reverse engineer your prop tech solution from the point of view of the problem. So if there's a genuine problem, like why does it take 6 months to sell a house? Well, solve that. You won't be able to solve it all with technology, but people like Gazelle are trying to solve part of that process. So I would do something that genuinely had a solution to it. But the other thing, and look, I've got an involvement in Keller Williams as an investor in Keller Williams Essex. Only an investor. I don't have anything to do with it. Mark Reddings and Claire Reddings run that business brilliantly, by the way. I would definitely invest in what I think is the best of all worlds when it comes to estate agency models, which is the self-employed agent being supported by a brand and a hub where the agent can earn what they're worth, i.e. 70% of the customer fee. And look, we're seeing a lot of them springing up now. So it's not just Keller Williams and EXP. You've got the likes of Hortons and Fine and Country. Simon Ledbetter, actually, this morning, it's just been announced, ex-chief marketing officer of Countrywide and Knight Frank and Keller Williams is now the CEO of Fine and Country. He will have very much in his sights pushing and advancing the Fine and Country hybrid self-employed model. And I'm speaking to various other entities that are also about to embark on that self-employed hybrid type journey. I think that is a lucrative future.
Do you think that they'll all have a base, a high street presence at some point?
No.
They'll just fall within that brand. Have that
brand. I am in two minds about that. It's a good question because I don't think branches for estate agents are necessary per se, but actually in certain places where I live, in Shenfield, which is part of Brentwood in Essex, having a branch here where Shenfield is very much the epicenter, where you've got boutiques and cafes and everyone's there 2 or 3 times a day to do their daily stuff. That branch then acts as an advertising hoarding. So I think that's very good from a marketing perspective. It's a bit like Foxtons did with the minis back in the day, 300 minis whizzing around London. So I think branches have a place, but you don't need 50 of them across Essex. You don't need 1,200 of them across the country. The way I see estate agency is kind of a small amount of branches or hubs that therefore have a physical presence, but those hubs serve a much bigger area with maybe 20 listers or 10 listers or whatever, dealing with a huge area. So in Essex, for instance, you might have one branch, like Keller Williams have got one market centre. Keller Williams Essex have now got 73 agents. 73 agents.
It's amazing, isn't it?
But with one presence. So I don't think you have to have the branch, but I think in some areas they're handy to have from a facade perspective.
Do you invest in property yourself, Russell?
I have done. So I'm a landlord. Not in a big way, to be honest. I've invested, I suppose, in property as in the service side, because
not the physical.
Because I founded with James Lockett Proper PR, which is a property-focused PR agency. That's definitely an investment in property. Keller Williams is an investment in property, and other bits and pieces where I sit as a consultant or a non-exec director, where I have equity. So I definitely invest in the premise of property, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the physical asset. But yeah, look, I've spent my life around property, so it's kind of what I know, really.
If you were a property estate agency owner, would you put your money into PR or would you put your money into the marketing? Or should you do both?
Well, you should.
Not a trick question.
No, look, obviously I'm a massive advocate of PR and I am biased because I run a PR agency that I think is probably the only genuinely property-focused PR agency in the country. But PR is super important from the point of view of not just raising awareness, but actually creating trust and credibility for your brand, your founder, and so on. So I think that's really important to do, but it should always be treated as part of the channel mix. So, using just PR, and look, proper PR have got clients that only use PR as their channel. That's a bit singular-minded, I think. You want to be doing other things. Those other things depend on whether you're a big business or a small business, whether you're B2B or B2C, but you should probably be using PR to kind of underpin a bit of Google AdWords, some social media content, maybe some display adverts or whatever. So it's definitely a holistic thing. But not forgetting that PR, good digital PR, where you're getting lots and lots of digital coverage, would also help and assist your SEO profile with Google. So the more digital mentions you get, the greater your domain authority, the higher your website will rank. And therefore, PR and SEO actually are kind of two sides of the same coin. So both very important, but they come as a consequence of each other, really.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So I know we're just conscious of time, so I'm just going to ask you one more question if that's okay, Russell. What advice would you give your 20-year-old self knowing what you know now?
Stop drinking. No, I don't know. Stop doing stupid things. My 20-year-old self, I mean, actually, my advice just a couple of years back from that would be go to university. I didn't go to university, and that's my biggest regret, actually. I don't think you need to go to university to be successful, but actually I wanted to go into law. And of course, my parents were terrible at support and advice, frankly. So I didn't get that push to go to university, whereas, I could have been a really horrible lawyer, I think. But in property terms, patience. I'm afraid it's something that not many of us have in abundance. I've always been one of these people that wants success really quickly and wants to get from kind of A to Z without going through B, C, D, E. I've learned, I think, maybe from Emoov, I suppose, that although Emoov was a 9-year journey and, had lots of successes but ultimately failed, that you shouldn't necessarily try to run fast all the time. I think back to your marketing question, you have a choice as a startup. You can go and raise 5 million quid in seed money or as your Series A and spend it all on Google AdWords and then have nothing to show from it apart from a bit of a blip in terms of growth that keeps your current short-term investors happy for a few weeks. Or you can play the long game with PR and SEO and building a brand and a personal brand and end up actually spending that money less quickly, growing a bit more slowly, but actually still surviving at the end of it. So patience, I think, would be my advice to my 20-year-old self. But look, easier said than done. What 20-year-old takes advice? I don't know any.
I'm sure there's some out there listening, hopefully. Russell, thank you so much for your time. How can some of the listeners reach out to you if they're looking for PR or they're looking for just maybe general advice? If you're willing to give it, what's the best way to connect with you?
Yeah, look, I always try and help founders. I do get quite a few people kind of ask me for advice. I always try and help. I can't do loads of kind of 1-hour calls helping, 6 founders a week because there's not enough hours in the day.
Of course.
If anyone wants to talk about PR, of course, look, you can either find me on LinkedIn where I'm pretty visible, or Twitter, or Russell at properpr.co.uk. But look, always happy to try and help founders. Just don't take the piss.
Absolutely. Russell, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Thank you.
Take care. Cheers.
Cheers.
If you like this video, then please check out the video on the screen right now. And please don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more content from property leaders. And please remember to comment on the video below. Thank you.